Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you all for watching. So in this video, I'm going to continue my discussion of issues in the philosophy of mind, and I'm going to go back to 1974 for this discussion. The discussion will be about Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What is it like to be a bat? So 1974 essay where Thomas Nagel, he poses a significant problem for those who would want to say that the mind or that mental states or that consciousness is something purely physical. He will get into the details of the challenge, but keep in mind that big picture, those of you who know the paper, at least you know the way the paper ends. Nagel doesn't think we should give up on the physicalist project in the philosophy of mind, but he certainly wants to point out that there are some serious problems facing those who would want to say that that the mind, that consciousness, the conscious experience is to be understandable in purely physical terms. So he would claim that there's major issues with trying to say that that the mind, mental events, conscious experience, etc., is reducible to the brain, some parts of the brain, or the like. Okay, so that's a big picture project. And it's really a significant paper in this regard. There were many philosophers who were taking it quite for granted that the mind could be reduced quite straightforwardly to the brain. And in a series of papers, one that we discussed last time, philosophers like Nagel and Frank Jackson, who we talked in a previous video, really pose some significant problems that the physicalists would have to deal with in order to have a full physicalism worked out. So we know that in the Frank Jackson's piece, Epiphenomenal Qualia, that he ends up arguing for a kind of dualism. It seems like he wants a kind of property dualism, a different kind of dualism than that of, say, Alvin Plantinga. So Plantinga wants a substance dualism. Nagel, he poses a significant challenge to physicalism, but at the end of the day, he is in the physicalist camp. Okay, so he is a physicalist, but he just recognizes that we are a long way off from having anything like reduction. We're a long way off from having the kind of reduction that we have in, say, our effort to reduce, water to H2O. So there, it seems like we've arrived at a reduction, and of course now reducing, H2O to perhaps more simpler parts is still in the works. That hasn't quite happened yet. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't. But still, we know that we've got at least a partial reduction when we reduce water to H2O. And those who would want to reduce the mind to something brain-like, or some brain event, or mental events to brain events, that reduction, it faces serious problems, according to Nagel. Okay, so hopefully that point is clear. Hopefully the idea of just a reduction is clear. When we try to reduce the x's to the y's, so let x and y just be variables here for different phenomena. When we try to say that the x's just are the y's, we're saying that the x's are nothing over and above the y's, or something like that. So you can give a complete account of the x's in terms, right, of the y's. So if we're going to say that water is H2O, water is nothing over and above H2O, just for example. There's some other examples that Nagel gives us at the very beginning of his paper. So this is on page 435 of the essay that was published in the Philosophical Review, again in 1974. We also have genes reduced to DNA. Okay, we have that reduction. Okay, we have the water H2O example. And there are a couple others that he mentions, but those will suffice for our purposes. What we're doing there is we're saying, when we understand like what a gene is, it just is nothing over and above, right, DNA. Okay, and we're familiar hopefully with the idea of what DNA is. So the same thing happens in the philosophy of mind. I mean, it's something I've been saying in a series of philosophy of mind videos now. So we want to understand what the mind is. We want to understand what conscious experience is, what consciousness is, perhaps more generally. And some philosophers think that the best way of understanding what these things are is to understand them in terms of what we can scientifically investigate in the physical sciences, the relevant organ. That's part of the human being that seems connected to the mind, consciousness, conscious experiences, right, up here in the brain, okay? But of course, there's different accounts that have been developed. Okay, so what Nagel says on page 436, so I've got the essay right here in front of me. Hopefully you do as well, perhaps on your computer screen, or you can look it up. You can find a PDF of it online pretty readily. For those of you who are associated with universities, of course, you could look it up on one of your campus library databases, JSTOR, for example. It should be there. It's a really, really famous paper. But I'll say 436, Nagel notes conscious experience. It's a widespread phenomenon. Surprise, surprise. Okay, we have it. Okay, we know that many members of the animal kingdom have it. It occurs at many levels of animal life, he continues, though we cannot be sure of its presence in the simpler organisms, and it is very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. Some extremists have been prepared to deny it even of mammals other than man. Okay, that seems quite extreme, right? It seems pretty clear that our puppies, that our cats, our companion animals, the great apes, and a wide variety of animals that we're in interaction with, or at least otherwise, perhaps see through television and other mediums. Those animals have consciousness, conscious experience. No doubt it occurs in countless forms totally unimaginable to us on other planets and other solar systems throughout the universe. Okay, right? Supposing the universe has other conscious beings in it. Okay, obviously that would take quite a bit of an assumption. Will allow SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and these kinds of endeavors to satisfy these empirical claims. We don't have to take a stance on them. Nagel continues, but no matter how the form may vary, the form of conscious experience may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all, says Nagel, means basically that there's something it is like to be that organism. So he's locking in on this, what it's like to be an organism. There may be further implications about the form of the experience. There may even be implications about the behavior of the organism, but fundamentally an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there's something it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. So that feature of conscious experience, of consciousness, that Nagel is locking in on is conscious experience, what it is like to be that organism. And of course, we know from the human perspective what it's like to be human. Okay, we might struggle finding the words for it, but in virtue, as it were, of having consciousness, we have conscious experience, and that means that there's something it's like to be a human. Okay, and that's something that we can all relate to. And what Nagel is saying in this paragraph is this is true for all forms of conscious experience beyond just the human. In other words, or to give an example, the companion animals that we run with, our dogs and our cats and the like, they have conscious experience. And there's something it's like to have conscious experience even for those forms of life. Nagel continues, this is still on page 436, we may call this the subjective character of experience. So these expressions might seem like they're common sense, but what Nagel's doing in a sense is he is bringing to light a significant problem that he believed was underappreciated. And so that's why his piece is widely cited, widely read still to this day, because he's someone who comes along and it's like, okay, we've got this effort to try to reduce consciousness to something physical, the brain or brain states, something like that. But he believed that it had been underappreciated, the fact that we have conscious experience, that there's something it's like to be an experiencer, and that if physicalism is true about the mind, right, then those subjective experiences, as he calls them, the subjective character of experience more generally, would have to be explained in physical terms. Okay? So again, it was believed by Nagel that this had just been underappreciated. So what Nagel wants to try to do is he wants to try to drive home the problem in a memorable way. So the title of the piece again is, what is it like to be a bat? ? Okay. The significance of the bat example, at least in part, is to try to remove us from the human perspective for a moment and focus on the kind of experience that would be had by a bat. and he claims that whatever we think about the conscious experience of a bat, it's going to be much different from our conscious experience of bats. And so you can think about like big picture, what he's up to is like, look, we can understand scientifically, in fact we do understand scientifically quite a bit about the way in which a bat experiences. We understand, how it uses echolocation to circumnavigate the world, right? It sends out, sounds from its, voice box and is able to detect, the ways in which those sound waves reflect off of objects. I mean, can you imagine being, circumnavigating the world in that way? So Nagel, he uses this bat example in order to say this is a totally alien, form of life, alien form of consciousness, and we can understand the physics. We can understand the physical makeup of the bat in all kinds of ways. We can take cadavers of bats and do all kinds. We can even test them alive to try to understand how it is that their echolocation works, for example. But gosh, what is it like to be a bat? And on this point here, it's not just an imagination point. It's not just the claim that we can't imagine, right, what it's like to be a bat. We can't conceive of it, so it's even beyond an imagination point. So one of the ways in which we do conceive of things, of course, is through imagination. But there are things that we can conceive that seem like that we can't imagine them. So perhaps when we're doing like abstract mathematics at a certain point, or abstract philosophy even at certain points, right, abstract logic, we're not forming images, and if we are, they're hard to specify exactly. And so conceivability is such a much broader notion of a mental state that we can be in. Imagination is a kind of conceivability, or kind of way in which we conceive more exactly. So what Nagel is pointing at here is the fact that, look, it's inconceivable, right, what it's like to be a bat from our perspective. Yet we can understand, right, the physical makeup. We can understand the brain and the perceptual apparatuses. We can understand the echolocation apparatuses that bats have, right, from an objective perspective. But getting inside their minds subjectively seems like it is just blocked from us. It seems like there's an impossibility. So there's a kind of connection between, if something's inconceivable, then it's impossible. Now Nagel's not committing himself to that claim here, but there is a loose connection between, or maybe even a tight connection. So tight connection is probably a better way of describing it, between something being inconceivable and it being straightforwardly impossible. So you've got all the physical facts, but you don't have all the facts thereby, okay? Because what it's like to be a bat just seems like it's closed. There is a sort of a gap that seems like it's unbridgeable. And the same thing would be true for us. So he begins with a bat example to sort of illuminate his point in memorable terms, but then there's us. There's human beings, and there's all the physical facts that we can know about our makeup. But there's going to be a gap between all those physical facts and explaining, as it were, the ways in which we're conscious, the subjective character of conscious experience. This is a point that's closely developed by Frank Jackson in his later piece, okay, that Nagel developed earlier in this 1974 piece. Okay, so I think we understand the kind of argument that's been developed here. So what Nagel ends up concluding is like, look, we have this gap. It's become known as the explanatory gap, that the physicalist would have to close if the physicalist project is to succeed. And he claims that this is the pressing problem. This is the hard problem, sometimes it's called as well in the literature. And it needs to be bridged. And physicalists can't underestimate this problem. They need to take it and tackle it head on. But here's the claim by Nagel: we're a long way off still. So that's Nagel's conclusion, is let's still go with the physicalist project. It's something that we should be trying to do, but we have to recognize the nature of the project in front of us, and we can't just bracket off and ignore the subjective character of experience. That has to get explained, guess what, in physicalist terms. And physicalist terms are objective terms. So we have to find a way of understanding subjective consciousness, the nature of subjective consciousness, in objective terms. That's another way of understanding the gap that Nagel's pointing at in his famous paper. Okay, so thank you all for watching. If you have questions, just ask them below or email me, jedickin@syr.edu. Thanks again for watching. See y'all soon.